One of the key criticisms issued by Torah observers and Hebrew roots folks is that Christians who don't abstain from pork and shellfish are in sin. Is that really the case? At Sinai, God gives Israel guidelines about what animals to eat. This comes from Leviticus 11 primarily. Here's how that section begins. Leviticus 11, 1 through 8. The Lord spoke again to Moses and to Aaron, saying to them, Speak to the sons of Israel, saying, These are the creatures which you may eat from all the animals that are on the earth. Whatever divides a hoof, thus making split hoofs, and chews the cud, among the animals that you may eat. Nevertheless, you are not to eat these among those which chew the cud, or among those which divide the hoof. The camel, for though it chews cud, it does not divide the hoof, it is unclean to you. Likewise, the sharfan, for though it chews cud, it does not divide the hoof, it is unclean to you. The rabbit also, for though it chews cud, it does not divide the hoof, it is unclean to you. And the pig, for though it divides the hoof, it does not chew cud, it is unclean to you. You shall not eat of their flesh or touch their carcasses, they are unclean to you. I'm going to address the argument that the mere presence of this command means that all people everywhere are expected to eat this way. There are ancillary arguments that I cover in other videos that will be released around the same time as this one, so check the description or suggestions at the end of this to see if it's there. If not, it's coming. That is, if I've heard the argument. There are several reasons why these laws don't automatically apply to Christians. We'll talk about each in turn. First, as explained in another video in this series, the paradigm established before we even get to Sinai is that food laws change. Genesis shows two distinct food laws in effect at different times, in Genesis 1 and Genesis 9. So the pattern we've seen prior to the coming of the law of Moses is one of change regarding dietary laws, not fixed and unchangeable laws on this issue. Of course, it is only God who can change the law. That is the standard. Secondly, we see from the justification for this group of commandments that it is based on setting the nation of Israel apart, which is indicative of the ceremonial laws. Moral laws that truly are eternal and unchanging are based on justice and the character of God Himself. Ceremonial laws are laws specific to the Mosaic covenant that are given in their own context to set Israel apart, and in the redemptive context to point to Christ and His work in some way. We see the justification at the end of Leviticus 11, where God wraps up His group of commandments this way. Leviticus 11:44 and 45. For I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves, therefore, and be holy, for I am holy. And you shall not make yourselves unclean with any of the swarming things that swarm on the earth. For I am the God who brought you up from the land of Egypt to be your God. Thus you shall be holy, for I am holy. Holiness, in the context of the Torah especially, is the setting apart of something for a special purpose. Israel is set apart from other nations by means of their diet, among many other things. The principle is repeated again later in Leviticus. Leviticus 20:25 through 26. You are therefore to make a distinction between the clean animal and the unclean, between the unclean bird and the clean, and you shall not make yourselves detestable by animal or by bird or by anything that creeps on the ground, which I have separated for you as unclean. Thus you are to be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy, and I have set you apart from the peoples to be mine. God set Israel apart from the peoples, the other nations and non-Israelites in the land, and eating pointed to that. It is impossible for the dietary laws to have been intended for the other nations and set Israel apart from those nations at the same time. Genesis also presents obedience in separate categories. Almost exclusively, when God gives a command in Genesis, it is not for all people everywhere, but to a specific person or group for a specific time related to what is happening in God's plan. God commanded Adam not to eat the fruit in the garden. God commands Noah to build an ark. God commands Abraham to leave his homeland. God commands Hagar to return to Abram and Sarai when pregnant with Ishmael. In fact, one of the only things we see being commanded for all mankind are the dietary laws of Genesis, but these are still changeable. On the other hand, we see clear examples of sin that fall outside of the commands found in the text. Cain is warned that sin is crouching at the door before he murders Abel. Joseph's brothers' actions, kidnapping and selling Joseph into slavery, are considered intended for evil by them. Joseph won't give in to Potiphar's wife because this would be a sin against God. There are many such examples. Those parts of the overall law of God that are actually eternal, moral laws, are expressed differently in Genesis from commands. Although both kinds of law in the law of Moses are indeed expressed in command, this difference is still seen. Moral laws are either justified regarding God's own authority, not Israel's being set apart, or his justice, or there's no justification at all, which harkens back to Genesis, where there's no command at all. Here are just a few examples. Exodus 20:4 through 6. You shall not make for yourself an idol, or any likeness of what is in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the water under the earth. You shall not worship them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, on the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing loving kindness to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. Exodus 22:1. If a man steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he shall pay 5 oxen for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. Exodus 23:1 through 3. You shall not bear a false report. Do not join your hand with a wicked man to be a malicious witness. You shall not follow the masses in doing evil, nor shall you testify in a dispute so as to turn aside after a multitude in order to pervert justice. Nor shall you be partial to the poor man in his dispute. Exodus 23:7. Keep far from a false charge, and do not kill the innocent or the righteous, for I will not acquit the guilty. Exodus 23:8. You shall not take a bribe, for a bribe blinds the clear-sighted and subverts the cause of the just. Not all laws are created equal. That much is apparent when we read the text. The third reason why the dietary laws don't apply to Christians is because in the New Testament, Jesus and the apostles reveal to us that these things have changed. If dietary laws were not established as changeable in Genesis and based on the unfolding of God's redemptive plan as opposed to God's unchangeable character, it would be harder to understand the New Testament changing them. But these facts already established fit hand in glove with the clear teaching of the New Testament. Firstly, Jesus himself has declared to be clean what was unclean. This happens during his ministry, and then in his conversation with Peter in Acts 10. In Mark 7:18 through 19, we read, And he said to them, Are you so lacking in understanding also? Do you not understand that whatever goes into the man from outside cannot defile him, because it does not go into his heart, but into his stomach, and is eliminated? Thus he declared all foods clean. This text does require a bit of explanation based on the arguments leveled against Mark's words here. First, the parenthetical phrase at the end of verse 19 is not a textual variant. It exists in every single Greek text of this gospel at this point. It is not added by translators. However, you may see thus he in italics in some translations. The Greek here is 4 words, katharizon panta ta bromata. Word for word, that means cleansing all the food. One argument is based not on the Greek, but on the English of the KJV, which says purging all meats. It is said that the meat is simply eliminated out of the bowels and that this final phrase is part of the quotation of Jesus and just means that it exits, nothing more. The problem with this is that at the time the KJV was translated, purging carried a different meaning. It meant cleansing, and meats also carried a broader meaning, including all food. So the KJV doesn't rescue the Torah observant position. But what about still making it part of Jesus' words? Does that help? Well, if this is part of what Jesus said, then Jesus would be saying that eating anything, whatever goes into a man, becomes clean food when eliminated. Not only does this mean that eating something ceremonially unclean would become clean, but it would also become clean at precisely the point at which the law considers all food to have become unclean, when it is not food, but waste. Putting this final phrase in the mouth of Jesus creates bigger problems than it solves. Rather, making it a parenthetical remark by the author of the gospel preserves a common sense understanding, but then it becomes a statement about Jesus' words, not about digestion. This also fits better with what Jesus says clearly about food not defiling a person. As we saw, Leviticus 20:25 clearly states that eating something unclean does defile a person. The only way for Jesus' statement to be true is for there to have been a change, and that change takes place right here. It is Jesus' words that cleansed all the food. Jesus' words made all foods clean, so that nothing that goes into a man can defile him. And so most translators say he declared all foods clean to make this explicit. The ascended Jesus also visits Peter in Acts 10, where we see this discourse unfold. Acts 10:9 through 16. On the next day, as they were on their way and approaching the city, Peter went up on the housetop about the 6th hour to pray. But he became hungry and was desiring to eat, but while they were making preparations, he fell into a trance. And he saw the sky opened up, and an object, like a great sheet coming down, lowered by four corners to the ground. And there were on it all kinds of four-footed animals and crawling creatures of the earth and birds of the air. Get up, Peter, kill and eat. But Peter said, By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything unholy and unclean. Again, a voice came to him a second time. What God has cleansed, no longer consider unholy. This happened 3 times, and immediately the object was taken up into the sky. Now, this discourse precedes Peter being visited by 3 men sent from Cornelius, a Gentile who feared God and had had his own vision. With this begins the first conversion of the Gentiles, with Peter going to Cornelius' house and eating with him. The Torah observance response to this is that Peter doesn't ever eat the unclean animals, and that this was all just symbolism for the gospel going to the Gentiles. Jews considered Gentiles themselves to be unclean because they often ate unclean meat and did not practice the various cleansing rituals the Jews did. But saying this vision is only a symbol is problematic for several reasons. Peter is commanded to kill and eat, and when he refuses, the response from the Lord is that Peter must not call unclean what God has cleansed. Now, while the Jews did consider Gentiles themselves to be unclean, the Torah does not so define them. It speaks of certain detestable practices they do, but it never says that Jews should avoid Gentiles as unclean. What the Torah does call unclean are these animals, and Jesus says that God has cleansed the unclean. And that word cleansed is the same one we saw in Mark 7:19. Jesus cleansed all food in Mark 7, and now he declares to Peter that what Peter is calling unclean has been cleansed. As is common when we look at the way laws in the Old Testament are fulfilled in the New, a visible symbol meant to make a distinction between Jews and other nations is removed to show that the distinction will no longer apply. God's people are from every nation. The law served its purpose, and its removal served a like purpose. Explanations abound to try to avoid this, but like with the Sabbath command, we have texts like these that point to changes being made and laws no longer applying the same way. We lack any texts in the New Testament clearly reaffirming the dietary laws. Every single time the issue comes up, the language always points one way: the removal of this command as binding in the way it once was. And so we're not surprised when we look at the issue of food in Paul's letters, and he says things right along these lines. Romans 14:1 through 3. Now accept the one who is weak in faith, but not for the purpose of passing judgment on his opinions. One person has faith that he may eat all things, but he who is weak eats only vegetables. The one who eats is not to regard with contempt the one who does not eat, and the one who does not eat is not to judge the one who eats. for God has accepted him. Romans 14:14 and 15. I know and am convinced in the Lord Jesus that nothing is unclean in itself, but to him who thinks anything to be unclean, to him it is unclean. For if, because of food, your brother is hurt, you are no longer walking according to love. Do not destroy with your food him for whom Christ died. Notice that God has not made the opposite law to be in effect. God does not condemn the one who does not eat, as if what was once commanded is now sin. Rather, God has made what was once sin to no longer be sin. Just as once the Gentile nations could not become Israel, but now all nations can bow to Christ. Now, for answers to some other objections to this on other grounds, I have these videos coming out around the same time. So look for them or click if they are available now.